The sky turned the color of a bruised plum, and the wind, which had once been a steady companion, began to howl with the voice of 1,000 grieving spirits as the great mountains of water rose to meet our deck, crashing over the wood with a force that threatened to splinter the very soul of the vessel until the ship finally struck the hidden sandbar with a deep, exhausted groan. I felt the weight of the salt and shadow pulling me down, tumbling me through a chaotic world of white foam and black currents where the light of the surface was nothing but a flickering, distant memory, and I awoke hours later with the tide licking my boots and my lungs burning from the brine I had swallowed, standing alone as the only soul among the wreckage and watching the remains of my comrades drift away like autumn leaves on a pond. My first days were a fever of frantic movement because I could not afford the luxury of despair while the stomach ignored the grief of the heart, so I swam back to the broken skeleton of the ship 11 times before the waves could finish their meal, constructing a crude raft out of spare yards and topmasts to ferry back everything I could find, from the 2 sets of mathematical instruments and compasses to the 3 great Bibles and the heavy chests of gold coins that seemed so valuable then, but proved so worthless later. I hauled barrels of wet flour, kegs of gunpowder that I meticulously dried in the sun, and the most precious treasure of all, steel in the form of nails, saws and hatchets, while also bringing ashore the captain's dog and 2 cats, who became the first silent inhabitants of my island kingdom. With a rusted blade and a desperate, shaking will, I began to carve a life out of the wilderness, hauling heavy timber up a steep hill to build a fortress against the side of a rising rock face, weaving a fence of cables and stakes so thick and layered that no beast or man could easily breach it, eventually digging a cave deep into the sandstone to serve as my cellar and my sanctuary. I became a carpenter without a teacher, laboring for weeks with nothing but a hatchet and a heavy adze just to fashion a single rough table and a chair, and a farmer who wept over the first green shoots of barley and rice that rose from seeds I had accidentally shaken out of a dusty bag meant for poultry feed, tending to them as if they were the very golden icons of my lost civilization. I learned the mechanics of the earth through trial and error, realizing how the tropical sun could bake clay into brick, and after months of failures where my pots crumbled in the heat, I managed to fire earthen vessels that could hold water and withstand the flame, allowing me to finally boil goat meat and make a semblance of broth. I kept a calendar by cutting deep, ragged notches into a great cross of wood I planted in the sand, marking each short notch for the days of my labor and a heavy, jagged scar for the months that bled into years, while also keeping a journal with the small supply of ink I had salvaged until the last drop dried up, leaving me once again in a world where my thoughts remained unwritten and my history was etched only in the lines of my face. I watched my clothes rot away under the relentless humidity until they were little more than rags, forced to fashion a suit, a high, shapeless cap, and a heavy, awkward umbrella from the skins of the wild goats I had hunted, drying them in the sun with the hair outwards to shed the torrential rains that turned the island into a steaming cauldron of fever and rot. In that absolute silence, where the only music was the rhythmic pulse of the surf and the mocking cries of colorful birds, my mind became my only company and my most dangerous enemy, leading me to speak to the parrots and teach them my name, not because I expected an answer, but because the sound of a human voice kept the madness from creeping in from the dark edges of the woods. I looked at the sea every morning with a desperate hope that a sail might appear, then with a burning hatred for the horizon that held me captive, and finally with a cold, quiet acceptance that I was a creature of this earth now, more animal than Englishman, a master of a kingdom that consisted only of goats, cats, and a dog that eventually grew too old to hunt and died in my arms, leaving a void that no amount of island fruit or scenic beauty could ever fill. I spent nearly 2 years building a massive dugout canoe, felling a great cedar and spending months hollowing it with fire and axe, only to realize in my final exhaustion that I had built it too far from the water to ever launch it, a mistake that cost me a year of my life and taught me the bitter lesson of foresight in a world where there is no one to help you correct your errors. 20 years had passed in this lonely rhythm, and I had grown old in my solitude, my beard long and my skin toughened like leather, when the world suddenly shifted on its axis. I was walking along the shore after a storm when I saw a single print, the unmistakable, terrifying curve of a heel and the press of 5 toes in the wet sand, and I stood frozen for hours, my heart drumming against my ribs with the force of a trapped bird, as the island I had mastered suddenly felt alien, predatory, and filled with invisible eyes. The solitude I had once cursed now felt like a lost sanctuary as I spent years in a state of constant, trembling watchfulness, hiding in my fortifications and jumping at every rustle of a leaf, until I eventually witnessed the arrival of the canoes and the smoke of fires that told of the terrifying rituals of the tribes from the mainland. It was through this terror that I encountered Friday, a man fleeing for his life from those who would have consumed him, and when I stepped between him and his pursuers with the roar of my musket, a sound that shattered the silence of the island like the cracking of the heavens. He knelt before me in the sand and placed my foot upon his head in a gesture of absolute surrender and eternal gratitude. In that moment, the heavy mantle of the hermit fell away, and I was no longer a ghost haunting my own life but a master, a teacher and a friend. I taught him the names of things, the use of tools, and the concepts of a world he had never known, while he taught me the joy of a shared meal and the sound of laughter echoing through the trees. We spent years together as he learned my tongue and I learned the depth of a soul that owed nothing to the maps and ledgers of Europe, finding in our shared survival a brotherhood that transcended language and race, and together we saved his father and a Spanish sailor from the same dark fate he had once faced. We worked together to prepare for a journey we knew might be our last, but fate intervened when an English ship finally appeared on the horizon, embroiled in the chaos of a bloody mutiny led by a group of desperate men. I helped the rightful captain regain his ship through a series of tactical ambushes and psychological warfare, acting as a governor of a land I had tamed with my own two hands, and as I finally stood on the deck of a vessel bound for London, looking back at the green peak that had been my home, my prison, and my cathedral for 28 years, 2 months and 19 days, I realized the man leaving was not the merchant who had arrived. The transition back to civilization was a slow, painful awakening, for the bustling streets of London felt more crowded and chaotic than any storm I had weathered, and the obsession with gold and status seemed like a hollow mockery compared to the simple joy of a harvested grain of corn or the companionship of a loyal friend. I found that my plantations in Brazil had flourished in my absence, managed by honest men I had long since forgotten, yet the riches felt like a heavy weight upon a spirit that had grown accustomed to the lightness of a goatskin coat and the clarity of a star-filled sky. I often found myself walking the docks, looking out at the dark expanse of the Atlantic, knowing that somewhere out there, my island remained, untouched by the noise of the world, a silent monument to the decades I had spent speaking to the wind and carving my name into the very bones of the earth. I eventually married and sought a quiet life, but the spirit of the wanderer never truly died, and even as the hearth fire crackled in my home, my mind would drift back to the sight of Friday standing on the shore, the smell of the tropical rain, and the profound, terrifying freedom of being the only living soul in a world that belonged to no one but God and myself. I realized that the true island was not the land surrounded by water, but the space within a man's heart where he discovers what he is capable of when the world strips him of everything but his breath and his will to survive. And though I walked among men once more, a part of me remained forever on those sands, listening to the eternal pulse of the tide.